Sicario: Day of the Soldado, written by Taylor Sheridan and directed by Stefano Sollima, is a sequel to the 2015 thriller Sicario. This time, an attack happens on US soil, and the US government begins to prepare for war with the Mexican cartels. In order to kickstart the war, the government first tries to force the Mexican cartels to go to war with one another, so it's easier to combat them. When the CIA begins provoking the Mexican cartels, things only get uglier and uglier for everyone involved. Okay, so I'm pretty sure I've told you guys before that I love the original Sicario. I loved it because it felt like an honest portrayal of how difficult and violent this lifestyle can be for everyone involved. CIA, cartel, even the families caught in the crossfires. It felt like it held nothing back in how it portrayed an extremely difficult reality and how that reality shapes the people within it into morally complex human beings. Needless to say, I went into this sequel very worried. I watched the trailers a few times, and each time I got the vibe that this was an unnecessary sequel that no one really asked for, and it didn't look like it'd be able to capture the spirit of the first one. I still maintain the belief that the marketing wasn't the best overall, but I was definitely wrong about the film itself. It was excellent. This is probably the biggest surprise of the year thus far for me, because I really did go into the theater expecting to not like this movie, and I wanted to tell you that it wasn't as good as the first one and it shouldn't exist. But exiting the theater, I almost felt the complete opposite of that. There's a compelling story that's told here, a story that further advances two of the main characters from the first and also retains those morally complex themes that made the first film so interesting. There's a lot of things that happen in this movie that make it clear that there aren't really any good and bad guys in this story. Everyone is just trying to achieve their own goals through their own means that often blur the line between right and wrong. That moral ambiguity was there in the first and it's there in the second in a very similar capacity. Something the first film also does really well that the second one also does pretty damn well too is the action. This is a gripping thriller film that I think a lot of people are going to be completely locked into, because I know I was. There's several scenes that do an excellent job of making you feel the weight of this violent game these two sides are playing. The stakes feel real, the action feels exciting, and the tension builds and builds until it reaches that breaking point. This is a really well-paced movie that knows how to play to its strengths. I know it's coming out in the summertime and a lot of people are looking for action and excitement during this time, but at the same time, the action has to mean something because the core of the movie is that gritty realism that, like I mentioned, blurs the line between right and wrong and moral and immoral. The action is great, sure, but a large reason it is because of the context in which it occurs. I mentioned Taylor Sheridan's name earlier as the writer because he's the writer of the first film. He wrote Hell or High Water and he wrote and directed Wind River too. Each of these films placed a heavy emphasis on cinematography and just making sure that the tone is relayed clearly to the audience through the visual storytelling aspects. Sicario: Day of the Soldado does exactly the same thing, and that's why I mentioned his name. I actually think this might be the best shot film I've seen in 2018 thus far, which is certainly an achievement and definitely a surprise like I mentioned. The cinematography just does an excellent job at establishing atmosphere and tone, and retaining that consistent feel throughout a 2-hour runtime, which is really difficult to do. There's some amazing aerial shots to show you the true power and force of our military and the landscapes that help define the setting. And just overall, this is a film that reminded me a lot of Hell or High Water from a visual perspective. The setting plays a big role in both Sicario films, and the cinematography does an amazing job making you feel the weight of those characters' surroundings. The music also does a great job. It's very eerie, brooding stuff. But maybe the biggest thing this movie has going for it is Josh Brolin and Benicio del Toro's performances, which isn't going to be a surprise to a lot of people probably, but still. These two were just simply outstanding, and anytime the film drifts away from them, it's not nearly as compelling. These two characters were just so confident and so badass and so morally complex that I was locked into just watching what they were going to do next. What I like about these two is that they're both not afraid of getting dirty. They'll do things that you as the viewer are not going to be comfortable with most of the time, but it's not like they have no code whatsoever either. They're playing dirty in a dirty game, so they kind of do that because they want the results. You got to play the game at that level to get the results that you need or that you want. This helps the stakes feel real and helps add that gritty realism that grounds the entire experience. Their characters have depth to them, and so does this world, and that's kind of a match made in heaven. But yeah, anytime the film starts to drift away from those two for a prolonged period of time, it's just not as good. Because considering we don't have Emily Blunt, there's not another major character that truly picks up the slack whenever the screen time shifts to another character that's not one of the main two I mentioned. Everybody's good, don't get me wrong, no one's really bad here, but there's several subplots going on that don't quite work as well as anything that directly involves Josh Brolin and Benicio del Toro's characters specifically. Those two are a little more developed, a little more interesting, and just better performed than all the other supporting characters really turn out to be. Again, those characters are fine, but there is a cinematic decline whenever the film shifts towards other characters besides the main two. What kind of disappointed me though is that the first two acts are so good, damn near as good as the first, but the third act just sort of crumbles. It almost felt like the third act was directed by someone else entirely because it almost didn't even feel like the same movie. The film sort of betrays itself in the third act. Things just start to happen that begin to feel unbelievable, and it starts to feel like the characters aren't acting within the bounds of their previously established motives anymore. It becomes cliche in a way, and that's in stark contrast with the rest of the film and the entire first one that's anything but cliche. In a film that's built upon the foundation of gritty realism, the third act just goes in an opposite direction and it just feels lesser. It's hard to be any more specific than that because I could definitely spoil this movie for you if I'm not careful. All I'll say for now is that the third act isn't 100% consistent with what's known about the characters, and the ending just kind of feels like a cheap way to set up a sequel. Other than that though, I love this movie and it's definitely the biggest surprise of the year thus far for me. Let's go ahead and look at the pros cons list though. As for the pros, I thought Sicario Day of the Soldado delivered a gripping, gritty, and tense story, some beautiful cinematography, standout performances from Josh Brolin and Benicio del Toro, and exciting action. As for the cons, I think the third act and ending sort of betrays itself and isn't consistent. Overall, I'm going to give Sicario Day of the Soldado a 9 out of 10, and definitely recommend you check this one out in theaters if you enjoyed the first or you just like gritty thrillers. I just like the rest of the movie so much that the third act didn't really diminish my experience too drastically. It's an excellent film and well worth a watch. So did you guys see Sicario Day of the Soldado yet? What did you think of it? And if not, let me know why not. And also let me know your thoughts on Sicario 1 and why exactly Sicario 2 is getting mediocre reviews right now. Almost kind of negative reviews depending on how you're looking at the scale. I'm honestly a little surprised by how low the scores are both from the audience and the critics. I thought the movie was great, like I mentioned, with a few flaws here and there that do kind of bring it down a tad. Make sure to let me know your thoughts on all things Sicario in the comments below. Either way though, this is WillFoxification signing off. See you in the next review.